Good afternoon, and welcome to this joint event hosted by the IHR Modern Religious History Seminar and the History of Sexuality Seminar. I'm Alana Harris, and I'll be chairing this session on sex, religion, and the Sixties through the lens of Callum Brown's new book, The Battle for Christian Britain. When the seminar conveners began planning this event back in February, we'd envisaged a short paper from Callum, followed by a Q&A, canapes, and some celebratory bubbles, to be subsidised by Kings, as champagne is not usual IHR offering, I hasten to add. When we reworked our plans in May, the first week of teaching at London universities seemed like a highly sensible and logical proposition. After all, energy levels at the start of teaching would still be high, wouldn't they? So, while some of our planning assumptions have needed revision, what hasn't changed is our excitement at having Callum speak to us this evening about his new monograph. And moving this event onto YouTube and Zoom has meant that greater numbers of people all over the world could attend this event. We'll also record the panel discussions which follow. Zoom buttons will ask you to consent to this, so that those who are prohibited from attending due to time differences or family commitments can catch up on the intellectual feast in store. So in that respect, some unanticipated benefits deriving from this virtual format. Ahead of the start of the Zoom session, and in line with what is now online seminar protocol, I would ask you please to turn off your cameras and mute your microphones. Chances for participant engagement will follow, as I'll outline soon. So some introductions. Callum Brown, Professor of Late Modern European History at the University of Glasgow, hardly needs an introduction to this audience, so I'll keep this very brief. Callum's Death of Christian Britain was published in December 2000 and has, of course, been a debate-defining text since. Much discussed and dissected in print and person over 2 decades. As he has stated before, Professor Brown intended a trilogy of books, with his thought-provoking Religion and the Demographic Revolution, examining Canada, Ireland, the United States, and the United Kingdom in 2012, and the empirically rich and moving personal testimonies within his Becoming Atheist in 2017. But perhaps like the Skywalker saga, Callum's explanatory universe has burst outside these bounds, and we now have The Battle for Christian Britain, a 4th instalment of what he calls his books bringing a non-Christian gaze upon sex, secularisation, humanists, and the Sixties. And in the commentary we'll hear soon, it sounds like episode 5 is well underway too. Callum has provided some short introductory remarks about the book, which we'll play shortly, and these will be followed by 2 short commentary pieces by Professor Hugh McLeod and Dr. Brady, responding as scholars from the subdisciplines of the history of religion and the history of sexuality, respectively. I'll introduce them then. What will follow is then a 30-minute discussion panel between Callum, Hugh, and Sean. At 6:15, we'll take a 15-minute break in proceedings, and at that time, I will invite audience participants to pose their remarks and questions using the chat function, and we'll then have around 30 minutes to discuss these thoughts and perspectives together. While the session will formally close at 7 p.m, a virtual pub session will follow, soft or alcoholic according to preference, offering you the chance for a more relaxed exchange with cameras on amongst those able to stay. So without further ado, here are Callum's opening salvos.
Hello everybody, I'm Callum Brown. Very pleased to meet you all, and thank you all for turning up. I've been asked to talk for a few minutes about the book and about particularly different sources that I used. The battle I write about is one almost entirely ignored in religious history and rather thinly depicted in secular history. I write about conservative Christianity and its battle to retain and perfect Christian Britain in its own image, about its confident effervescence in the 1950s and its spectacular collapse in the late 1960s and 70s. The struggle that I depict has around 7 battlefields, listed in the book, two of which I don't tackle. One of the ones I don't tackle is a battle between conservative and liberal Christians. I strain to find Protestant historians even uttering its name in relation to the mid-20th century, let alone researching its structuring of church life ever since. It's one of the remarkable features of Protestant historiography that it can talk about the rising influence of liberal ideas in Wolfenden and Chatelet and gay marriage, yet not even mention it. All that was part of the long-running civil war in the churches. The only scholar who it seems to me to be facing up squarely to the reality of church schism is Alana Harris, dealing with the Catholic Church and its attitude towards birth control. Now, I am ill-equipped to deal with the breadth, the depth, and the theology of all this within the churches. But it strikes me that civil war there certainly was. It might have been quiet, demure, hushed, gentlemanly, yet it was one that had reduced Christianity in Britain, as in the West in general, to two entirely different regimes and outlooks on the nature of humankind. And it is still there. This is a massive sinkhole in the religious history treatment of the 20th century. Church historians, I believe, need to call a spade and get on with its research. The second battle I don't deal with in the book is the battle carried on by the secret state agencies against atheists and humanists in their supposed guise as progressive fellow travelers, to use MI5's quaint categorization. At the time I wrote the book, I tried to have a chapter on MI5 and special branch surveillance of humanists and atheists, but failed because seemingly no files were yet opened, even on those like Bertrand Russell, who openly wrote about being interviewed by MI5 officers. Now, things have changed, and the files are opening in 2020, and what rich pickings there are. I'm currently working on this topic, and I hope to have something out in a year or so about it. So, my book is about 5 other battle lines. The first is a battle mostly over sexual culture waged by the Public Morality Council. Founded in 1899 by the Church of England, it has surely been the most ignored major religious body of 20th century Britain. Its papers are in the London Metropolitan Archive in an agreeable part of London, and I encourage colleagues to get down to Clerkenwell or send their students down there to tackle the PMC's voluminous papers. I recount how it blossomed in the 1940s and 50s and seemed to be doing so well in the late 50s and into the early 60s, but then crashed suddenly in 1965. It crashed because of a concatenation of events: the swinging 60s, the end of local authorities' willingness to enforce sexual obedience on the young, the curious appointment of a new director, Edward Oliver, who opposed its obsession with sex, and the desire of Michael Ramsey, Archbishop of Canterbury, to be rid of what he regarded as the distasteful PMC, and particularly his responsibility for it. The second battle I look at was the struggle waged against sex by local authorities, prodded and harassed by the PMC or local churches, which got their servants elected as aldermen and baileys. The local licensing system was wielded as an instrument of the Lord, not just in the Western Isles, but also in Soho. Indeed, one major contribution of my study is highlighting the PMC's success in corralling smuttiness in Soho, hassling it there, with the closing down of many review bars of the early 1960s, their product, which other scholars seem to have missed. The PMC was vigorous in theatre and film censorship, becoming able to obtain some theatre scripts from the Lord Chamberlain ahead of approval and watch new releases at first showing in the BBFC cinema. A regime of sexually conservative Christians was in command, including in highly secular Sheffield, religious Glasgow, but not in Blackpool. One major assertion in my book is that the social historian, in search of the prototype of British libertarian sexual culture, should travel in their minds out of Soho and onto the promenade between Fleetwood and Lytham. That's where the British working classes rehearsed in their minds in mid-century what sexual liberalism was to look like. And it is interesting that in the mid-1960s, many British young people didn't march to Soho, but to the Fylde coast, where they camped out in the dunes of Lytham St Anne's and rocked to the Beatles playing Blackpool every Sunday night in the summer of 1963. The Beatles didn't even play that many public concerts in London. For working class youngsters, the swinging 60s happened a great deal in seaside resorts. The third battle line that I look at was that between conservative Christians and humanists. The main instrument of doing battle here was the Central Religious Advisory Committee, CRAC, at the BBC. Now, unlike the BBC's other external advisory committees, I show that CRAC was de facto a powerful internal committee at the Beeb, which worked beside their Christian brethren in the religious broadcast department to hold the Director General and the BBC's Board of Governors to not just the maintenance, but the perfection of conservative religious culture within the whole of the BBC's home broadcasting. If you read the minutes of CRAC, it is astonishing how often the Archbishops of Canterbury, York and Westminster were in attendance, with the DG and his assistant, Harman Griswood, turning up to be grilled jointly by clergy of the religious broadcasting department and the external clergy. In the 1970s, 2 Catholic cardinals were sometimes in attendance together. This was the most high-powered religious body of the British establishment in the 1960s and 1970s. The fourth battle line that interests me was the rise of humanist broadcasters, who, because of CRAC until the late 1960s, were effectively banned from talking about humanism on the Brains Trust, which they dominated. Huxley, Bronowski, Comfort, Wooten, Joad, and others. But they burst out in the 1960s and 1970s. First in anti-religious comedy, led by leading atheist and rationalist Jonathan Miller and the Beyond the Fringe crew. But it was in the field of documentaries that humanists changed British public culture so effectively from the 1970s. It started with Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man, which defined the union of science and art as at the centre of the humanist understanding of intellectual and moral change. I show in the book, interviewing BBC producers, how humanists came to dominate television documentary series across the board, which they do to this day, including in wildlife, astronomy, archaeology, and art. In all of these areas, humanists dominate. In this way, I introduce how British public culture in the heyday of terrestrial television placed evolution and non-religious morality centre stage in British public culture. And fifth and last, though more briefly in my account, there was a discreet tussle going on between the Church of England and the Catholic Church. A young Catholic administrator called Edward Oliver became a thorn in the side of Michael Ramsey for siding with humanists in high-profile projects of lobbying, especially over the Biafran War and over promoting moral education in place of religious education in schools in England and Wales. This story has yet more to yield about religious change in Britain between 1965 and 1985, when Oliver seems to disappear. If we get the time, I'm hoping that Alana Harris and myself can do some work on Oliver and his machinations with humanists, which reached the Vatican and Utrecht and the HQ of international humanism. I argue, I hope, by example in this book, for the fusion of religious and secular approaches to cultural history. I seek to pinpoint what must be the obvious, that the collapse of dominant Christian culture was not just about the decline of the churches or church-going, and though more slowly decline of religious belief as well, or about the rise of humanist culture. No. Secularization was so effective in the 1960s, 1970s, so sudden, so sweeping, because it was about the collapse of a conservative Christianity against which the British people, and especially the young, first cavilled, then railed, and finally turned its back. But I also show how the civil state of central government and the local authorities that I looked at in the book in some detail, London, Blackpool, Sheffield, Glasgow, and Stornoway, emerged as unwilling or as unable to sustain the anachronism of a regime of conservative religion. Secularization was so effective because, in the face of popular rejection, it was conservative religion that lost its hegemony in the state and in popular acquiescence. Thank you very much for listening.
And thank you very much to Callum, who is with us and will continue the conversation in person very shortly. But firstly, we'll turn to our respondents. And we've, as I mentioned earlier, have invited two respondents speaking effectively out of the history of religion and the history of sexuality to speak to Callum's sort of initial introduction. And so I'd like to call on our first commentator, who is Professor Hugh McLeod, Emeritus Professor of Church History at the University of Birmingham. From his first book in 1974, entitled Class and Religion in the Late Victorian City, Hugh has built his career around comparisons of religious trends across Britain, Europe, and North America in the 19th and 20th century, and capped off sort of an enormous corpus of influential work with his landmark 2007 monograph, The Religious Crisis of the 1960s. Hugh is presently working on a new book exploring the relationship between religion and sport in England since 1800, and is now going to respond. Thanks, Hugh.
Okay, can you hear me? Good, well, that's a relief. Every book by Callum Brown is an event. In spite of his amazing productivity, there are no potboilers. Everyone is deeply researched, everyone is full of ideas, and most have stirred up debate. To start with the research, I would say that Callum excels himself in this volume in seeking out new sources in unexpected places. He's travelled the breadth of the country or the length of the country from London to Stornoway. He's visited many unfrequented archives. He's looked at everything from the papers of archbishops and eminent humanists to the minutes of watch committees and the confidential files of the BBC. His biggest coup, I think, was his interviews with various former BBC producers who took the lid off events at the BBC in the 70s. Looking at the ideas, I think there's three areas where I would say the book's contribution to modern history of religion has been particularly important. The first, I won't say a lot about because Callum spelt it out fully in his presentation, but it's this question of whether the idea of a Christian Britain is still valid for the 1950s. This has been affirmed strongly by some historians, including Callum, and questioned by other historians. Well, Callum has, I think, here shone an important new light on the whole question by changing the angle, getting away from the familiar questions of what was going on at the BBC or in Parliament, and looking at the role of local authorities in licensing entertainments, the sale of alcohol, and deciding what was permitted on Sundays, and showing how they saw it as their duty to defend Christian norms in many cases, and when they didn't see it as their duty, there were various Christian agencies which tried to prod them into action. And as Callum said, his particular achievement is to show how the way this happened or didn't happen varied across different parts of the country and how it changed in the 60s, and to move away from the cliches of swinging London to look much more widely. The second area, which Callum's also mentioned in his presentation, is religion and the BBC. Again, the World War II boom in religious broadcasting is well known, as is the continuing influence of Christians in the years after the war. Callum has added detail on that, while also particularly highlighting the efforts to limit the presence of humanists on radio and television. I don't think he adds a great deal on the 60s. In fact, I was a bit surprised that there's no mention of Hugh Carlton Green, who was the Director General during that decade, and indeed of changes which he brought about. It's worth noting that Mary Whitehouse's war against the BBC started in 1964, and it was originally sparked off by her objection to what she saw as the liberal bias of the religious programme Meeting Point. However, it's really in the 70s that Callum gets fully into his swing. And here, I think what he's done, which is really interesting, is these interviews with producers, trying to show how they were working behind the scenes to try and extend humanist influence at the BBC. And particularly what I'd not previously realized, that the Bronowski program and the Ascent of Man was seen as a humanist counterblast to what was seen as the Christian bias of Kenneth Clark's Civilization. In fact, he goes on to suggest that humanists now dominate the BBC as much as Christians did in the 1940s and 50s. So I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that. I wasn't entirely clear whether Callum is suggesting that the many prominent broadcasters whom he mentions as being atheists and agnostics were in some cases appointed because of their religious views, or whether if they were known to have other religious views, they might not have got to the position of where they are, or whether it's just coincidental that so many of them turn out to be atheists and agnostics. So I think there's a whole story there which would be interesting to have a bit more fully explored. The third area where I think Callum's contribution is going to be particularly important is as a contribution to the neglected history of the humanist movement in the 20th century. Back in the 70s, Susan Budd produced a pioneering work on this subject, but relatively little has sort of in the way of academic study has been done since. And so Callum very effectively enters this, or fills this gap. And particularly interesting, I would say, is his focus on a group of humanists who had established by the 60s and 70s a prominent voice in various areas of public debate, going back in some cases to the 1930s. They included academics, medics, sex educators, and I think the one who he focuses on particularly campaign leaders, and in particular Madeleine Sims, the leader of the Abortion Law Reform Association. Callum highlights the leading role which humanists played in many of the campaigns which came to the fore in the 60s. The question which I think still needs a bit more exploration here is how this very small group of committed humanists, and Callum himself says that they were a small group, that the number of paid up members of the humanist and secularist organizations was small, how they succeeded not only in running very effective campaigns, but in achieving legislative changes. When one bears in mind that the 48 atheist and agnostic MPs in the 1966 Parliament were far outnumbered by the hundreds who claimed affiliation to some kind of religion. Moving on to debate, one of Callum's great talents is his ability to stimulate debate. 20 years after the publication of the death of Christian Britain, is it's still a key text in the long-running international debates on secularization in the 60s and 70s. The debates are not on the facts of secularization in this period, but on their causes and chronology, and also on the degree to which the central importance of secularization in this period should be nuanced by consideration of other religious or spiritual trends. In his book, Callum takes the arguments of the death as read and doesn't attempt to engage with its critics. However, I would say nonetheless that a large part of the present narrative can be accepted even by those who are not fully persuaded by the explanations of secularization offered in the death. One criticism of the death of Christian Britain, which will probably be applied to the present book, was that it exaggerated the extent of polarization in the 60s, to which Callum simply replied that the 60s were polarized. I would just add that the structuring of the present book around a series of battles clearly privileges polarization, and this is reinforced by quotations from people, if you like, at either end who clearly had a polarized view of what was going on, whether Madeline Sims on one side or Mary Whitehouse, and even the Daily Mail columnist Peter Hitchens on the other. Certainly polarizations were an important part of the 60s, and just in passing, I say I'm a bit surprised that Callum said that Protestant historians, I'm not quite sure who he means by Protestant historians, but he says that they seem to have ignored the battles between liberal and conservative Christians. And I'm a bit surprised by this claim, but anyway, I'd be interested to know why he thinks this. But anyway, that's just an incidental point. Polarization certainly is a part of the history, but there are many stories to be told about the 60s, and I think there's also scope for a view which also takes account of those people who were somewhere in the middle, who were not clearly on one side or the other of these battles. It needs to take account of reforms which took the form of compromise, and indeed of changes which happen step by step rather than in one huge battle. Well, to sum up, this book is a notable achievement, and I believe that it will be a worthy successor to those books which have already made Callum one of the recognized international stars of the history of modern religion. So thank you for that, Callum, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for kicking us off. I'd now like to invite Sean, and a brief introduction to Sean. Sean Brady is a lecturer of modern British and Irish history at Birkbeck, University of London. He's published a number of books and articles on homosexuality, masculinity, and same-sex marriage, and of course is one of the co-conveners of the IHR History of Sexuality Seminar 2. His current research focuses on questions of gender, sexuality, and sectarianism in Northern Ireland, and he's currently working on a book with the title Sex and Sectarianism, Gender and Sexuality in Northern Ireland's History. So over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Alana. I'm just sound checking that everything's all right. That's great. Callum Brown's new and exciting book, The Battle for Christian Britain, is indeed a genuine landmark in the historiography and also historical research. As with all of Brown's work, the results are compellingly argued and also provocative. Now, whether you agree with Callum's arguments or not, The Battle for Christian Britain already is a book historians cannot ignore. He definitely and emphatically intervenes in historiographical paradigms in Britain that rarely refer to each other, namely the history of religion in modern and contemporary history and the modern and contemporary history of sexuality in Britain. Most importantly, his book is not only a history of the churches and religion in the period, but also a history of what religious schisms and conservative campaigns do to people's lives, especially to people who do not believe in or participate in the beliefs concerned, through the use and also the abuses of local authorities and community organizations to impose conservative Christian values upon the freedom of individuals and autonomy over their own bodies and lives. My response to Callum's book this evening is based on the potential reception of this book and its resonance among historians focusing on sexualities and gender in the period in question. For Callum Brown, the battles he identifies in the 1950s and into the 60s and 70s between conservative and liberal Christians were suffused with concerns over sex and sexualities and also questions of gender. This fascinating civil war within religious communions was real and is barely discussed by historians of religion or sexualities. Recent work such as Brian Lewis's Wolfenden's Witnesses and Timothy Jones's work on Anglican interventions in processes such as Wolfenden do go some way in addressing the absence of questions of religion and also religiously inspired conservatism and also liberalism in regard to sexualities in the historiography of British sexualities. While Matt Cook and Heike Bauer's scholarly collection, The Queer 1950s, demonstrates amply that queer lives and cultures thrived in the 1950s, in spite of the ubiquity of social conservatism in that decade, the relationship between assertive conservative Christianity and social being for queer people in Britain is not discussed. Callum's work brings nuance and insight into the role and also the enthusiasm of conservative Christian moral vigilantism in the 1950s. And his presentation of these phenomena as battles and internecine ecclesiastical civil wars challenges, I think, both the ubiquity in gender conservatism, often asserted by historians of the 1950s, and also the lacuna in analysis of the influence of these civil wars in civil society and a growing sense of individualism in the decade. A further dimension to these battles, most especially in the 1950s and the early 1960s, was the role played by British humanists. Regarded as suspicious by conservative Christians, Brown is fascinating on the emphasis in British humanism upon the rights of the individual, especially autonomy over their own bodies, as a key factor in both being a perceived threat by conservative Christians and of significant influence in shaping the views of liberal Christians. Historians tend to privilege the analysis of secular ideas on sexualities as shaping sexualities in modern and contemporary Britain. But more recently, scholars have begun to consider the place and influence of religion, both conservative and liberal, in shaping sexual identities, in shaping public policy, in its influence on moral vigilantism, and also its influence upon social being. This is especially resonant in the contemporary history of North America and Australia. Scholarship such as Callum Brown's demonstrates amply that the battles for Christian Britain were indeed suffused with sex and anxieties over sex and sexualities, and also about women's reproductive rights. Through resonant repositioning of evidence and analysis from the 50s to the 1970s, Callum Brown opens up for debate among historians the relationship between the battles between conservative and liberal Christians and the effects these had on ideas on sexualities in Britain. The work of Alana Harris goes some way to illuminate this lacuna with her focus on the liberal conservative schisms within English Roman Catholicism in the late 1960s. But these divisions among Protestant denominations in Britain remain largely to be either recognised by historians or examined. Although Britain is, as Callum argues, increasingly and overwhelmingly secular. The strength and enthusiasm of conservative Christianity in the 1950s did leave its legacies for the future in regard to who won in terms of influence over policy and also inquiry about sex. His discussion of the increasing dominance in Britain of liberal Christian views from the 1960s onwards has major implications for the analysis of the elision of conservative Christianity and its influence upon sexuality in these forums. Callum's challenge to, for example, Frank Mort's work and also Judith Valkowitz's work, with their emphasis upon the avant-garde and the metropolitan milieu, is welcome and also resonant. He challenges the sexual geography of the period and brings into focus the battle between conservative Christianity and individualism in the provinces. In doing so, his work resonates with more recent work in this field that focuses upon locale and moves away from metropolitan narratives in the analysis of sexualities in Britain. For example, Helen Smith's book, Masculinity, Class and Same-Sex Desire in Industrial England, and also Justin Bengry, Matt Cook and Alison Oriam's Queer Localities AHRC project. Even more salient in this respect is his critically incisive analysis of the success of moral vigilantism in London in the period in the 1950s, and the ways in which this ghettoized so-called vice in London. Through his examination of Christian organisations such as the Public Morality Council and other similar entities in cities outside London, the existence and activities of moral vigilante organisations in the period provide a fascinating lens for analysis of these battles at the level of the urban locale. While Brown's historical turning point is the 1960s, and this is empirically resonant, I think more could have been made of Mary Whitehouse's campaigns and the influence of Muggeridge and others in the late 1960s and the 1970s. The point that Whitehouse removed and uncoupled her campaigns from the churches and removed moral vigilance from them, and thereby also distorting ecclesiastical moral vigilance in the 60s and 70s, is very well made indeed by Callum. But Whitehouse was a rather effective and persistent nuisance, especially to LGBTQ people and activists. While her campaigns could not be regarded in the same light as conservative Christianity as asserted in the 1950s, she did bring a successful blasphemy case against gay news in the 1970s, and the Watchers and Listeners Association did achieve the 9 p.m. watershed, which is still in place. In many respects, Whitehouse's battles were more public and attention-grabbing than the more localized efforts by moral vigilance groups up to the mid-1960s. That said, Brown's book opens up the debate properly on the relationship between conservative and liberal Christianity and public discourse on sexuality in Britain in the post-war era. Even my own area of research, Northern Ireland, where the presence of conservative Christianity is ubiquitous, very vocal, and highly related to moral vigilance and the policing of sexualities and women's reproductive rights. The place of religion in questions of sexualities in the province barely has been written about by historians. Brown's book raises the stakes for a thorough consideration of Christianity and the churches in the historical analysis of sexualities in secular Britain, making the elision of these considerations in the British and Irish contemporary historical period hard to ignore by historians. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Sean. We've had sort of two perspectives offered. I'm now going to sort of convene the panel. So if those participating, Sean, Callum and Hugh, would like to kind of unmute so that we can just freely exchange. And we've got about 20 minutes. We'll actually sort of shave another five off our break and take a break at 6:20. There are some absolutely amazing and sort of fascinating issues that have come out of both commentaries and actually sort of Callum's sort of opening introduction too. And I wanted to start by almost posing the question, why was it necessary to convene a seminar like this that brought together the history of sexuality and the history of religion? Why has there been such an elision between these historiographies? And what happens when you start to read these different historiographies together? What new debates and discussions and discourses sort of open out? Why does it matter that we need to start to debate across our subdisciplines? So I don't know who wants to kick off on that. John, you've got there's a box around you. Do you want to start?
Okay, that's absolutely fine.
Or even,
yeah, that's fine. I'll give it a go and people can chip in. Well, certainly over the last 10 to 15 years in the historiography of sexualities, particularly sexual minorities in Britain, there has been a tendency within that historiography anyway, those historiographical fields, to focus and privilege the scholarship in the wake of the ideas of Michel Foucault and a kind of alliance to the historical processes that Foucault argued for, which I and others argue are very difficult to apply to 19th or 20th century Britain or to Britain at all in many respects. Foucault really was thinking of within the walls of the city of Paris and France for his universalized polemics on the West, and not particularly thinking of Britain. So Britain always poses a kind of paradox and a challenge anyway to the historian, particularly the modern contemporary history of the country, because on the one hand, along with Sweden and Denmark and others, it's one of the most secular societies on earth. But on the other hand, Britain privileges religion in the public sphere in a way that other comparable industrial societies do not, like France and Germany, or even Italy to a large extent. And it is that paradox of lots of secular discourses, lots of secular organizations, that the question of religion or the negative effects of religion on people's lives barely registers either for the scholar, who are quite often liberal secular themselves, or didn't have an oppressive religious upbringing, but also there's much in the evidence of Britain since the Second World War that would support that, and yet drilling down to the locale, one of the things that resonated for me quite powerfully reading Callum's book and his sections on local authorities and local vigilantism. I'm in my late 50s now, and I grew up in the middle of Birmingham, and organisations such as the Birmingham Watch Committee, which was an entirely religiously orientated organisation, which he doesn't discuss, was very active in shutting things down and corralling things in Birmingham right into the end of the 1970s. So the legacies of these vigilante groups, existed within provincial cities right throughout the period that he's discussing. Now, to address Alana's point more directly about why these historiographies don't meet, that I think part explains the reason. But even in historiographical paradigms just across the water in Ireland, where you just cannot get away from the ubiquity of religion, the effects of that, have been, and also, the emphasis in Foucauldian scholarship is to lead or ignore persistently religious societies in the modern era, to the point that sexualities barely are discussed among historians in the Irish paradigm. So a tendency to privilege the secular in an overwhelmingly empirically secular field, I think has underplayed to a large extent the influence, particularly of conservative religion and conservative religious motivations in influencing sexualities. I think Hugh's point was very made as well about the number of atheistic or agnostic members of parliament. That hasn't changed very much. If you look at particularly now, the religious confessionality of most of our MPs in the House of Lords, the representatives don't actually represent the irreligiosity of people within Britain. It is it's another one of those paradoxes that members of Parliament are overwhelmingly profess a religious faith, whereas most of the population do not.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, over to Callum or Hugh. Maybe Callum, have you got some? You obviously wrestled with this and wrestled with it quite a lot in the opening pages of the book. So what conclusions do you come to about why we need an event like this to bring distinct groups of people together.
Well, first of all, can I thank Hugh and Sean for most remarkably generous comments, as well as some critical ones, but really very generous comments, which I much appreciate. On sex and religion, in one way, my book is not that original. It may be different in the British context, but I take a great deal of my lead from the United States and American historians. And I think it behoves historians of sexuality and especially religion in Britain to look more at what is done in the States and has been done for decades. I've taught, and I know some of my students, current and former, are watching this. I have run a course since 2013 at University of Glasgow on sex and religion. And it seems absolutely vital to bring those two together, to explain what has happened as I study it for students, Britain, America, Canada, and Ireland between 1945 and 1980. You cannot understand those societies in broad terms or in detailed terms without looking at the interaction of sex and religion. I say at the outset of the book, quite briefly perhaps, in one paragraph, that one of the examples, a key example that I, in a sense, am copying in that book is the work of Beth Bailey. If there's a single historian this book owes a debt to, it is Beth Bailey. And those who may study sexual religion in the UK, if you don't know Beth Bailey's work, go read it. She, particularly in a book published in, I think, 1993, took a Midwest university town, whose name escapes me for a minute. Is it Lawrencetown in Kansas? And she picked that for a case study because it was for her, as she put it, the ultimate not New York in the United States. The ultimate not New York. And lo and behold, I mean, the primary thing she was doing, she was asking the question, American historiography at that time had said the sexual revolution is on the West Coast and the East Coast and metropolitan areas. It's not bang in the middle. And she shows it very much was. And she shows that all those battles that you look at in relation to the gay revolution in the way in which young heterosexual couples were trying to get freedom to meet and have sex on their own terms, not have watch committees and the police picking them up off the streets, and having young people, as happened in Britain, which people have not really studied properly, young people who were being brought before the courts because they were morally endangered. I know that colleagues at Edinburgh University have studied this a bit, but there's more to be done on that front. And I think that the American approach to the way that religion and sexuality and sexual control collided in the 50s and 60s, borrowing that paradigm, there's a lot more to be done in relation to Britain. Including, yes, rightly, I didn't spend a great deal of time on Mary Whitehouse in my book, in part because Mary Whitehouse's narrative has been told quite well by a lot of other people, Lawrence Black, for instance. And what I wanted to do with Mary Whitehouse was to point out, though, that some existing interpretations were slightly wrong in seeing her as representing the establishment in the 1970s. She was not. The churches detested her. The Church of England hierarchy made a point of detesting her. And the Public Morality Council, of which I study a great deal, the man who took over that council in mid-1960s, Edward Oliver, he was very disparaging about Mary Whitehouse and the northern white housewives, as he called it, who were now dictating the moral issues in Britain. So yeah, there's a lot more to be done on Mary Whitehouse, but I thought I had other things to say. I did position her in relation to the churches, so that was my priority. Can I also make a mention for MRA, moral rearmament? It's time that there was really serious study of MRA. I gather that their records are deposited in Cambridge. It's time to assess its influence. One of the things I found MRA were very strongly trying to get the major church leaders in the UK on site, particularly Cardinal Heenan. There was a huge play for Cardinal Heenan, and Heenan's archivists have created a separate file on MRA and their approaches. And Heenan was being pestered. I mean, that's the only word for it. Year after year in the late 60s and 70s. He did eventually accede and agree to go to watch a drama at the Westminster Theatre, which was the MRA Theatre in London. What resulted after that, I'm unclear. But there are still unleft parts of the story to look at. And I think we underestimate the power of conservative Christianity when there were so many different agencies at work. Not all getting on agreeably. There was a great deal of tension. Church of England liberals in the mid-1950s were extremely suspicious of MRA and wanted it more or less banned from the Anglican Communion, but it was only rescued by evangelicals in the Synod. That story has been well told, and I just sort of noted it in passing. So yes, it's an unfinished story. And I think sex was the litmus test for the conservative Christians' view of religiosity in the mid-1960s. That was certainly the case in the Isle of Lewis, certainly the case in Glasgow, and scholars before me, Roger Davison and Gail Davis, have written a great deal about Glasgow in regard to that clash. And I think it applies more broadly. The exceptions, I mean, I think London was an amazing place for activity by moral vigilantes. I think the existing narratives, as Sean says, about the metropolis focus far too much on Soho and its supposed freedoms. But Soho was nightly the target of vigilantes who were going in there, paid and unpaid members of the Public Morality Council. They employed, all the way through from the 1900s to their dissolution in 1965, they employed an ex-sergeant of the Metropolitan Police. It was always a sergeant and always a bloke. And his duty was to patrol the streets, and overwhelmingly of Soho. And there's a dissertation at the University of Kiel just about that particular part of Public Morality Council work. And his job was to find out where were the streetwalkers, where were the pimps, where were the brothels, and he snitched on them to his ex-colleagues in the Metropolitan Police. And his targets for his job, he measured on a monthly basis in terms of number of prosecutions arising from his snitches to the Metropolitan Police. And that was overwhelmingly going on in Soho. So Soho was not a completely free place. In the early 60s, the review bars were closing. People were getting imprisoned, and a huge fine of £5,000 was imposed upon one entrepreneur who ran a review bar. So there's a wider question that Hugh's asked of my conflict approach. I just tend to say, well, look at the evidence. Look at the files. Look at the letters that were received and sent by Michael Ramsey as Archbishop of Canterbury. He was right in the thick of it. He didn't know which way to turn. He had the free churches coming at him on one side saying, you're ignoring the British Council of Churches. You're doing your own thing. He was trying to accede to liberals. But it was almost an impossible task for him to keep conservatives happy and at the same time keep liberals happy. And I'd say in that one person, you can see somebody sitting on the fence, trying to keep everybody happy. I would still say that even if you didn't have liberals and Christians bashing each other about the head, there was clear evidence of a battle. And I'll finish on this point. One of the hate figures for conservative Christians was John Robinson, absolutely detested by conservative Christians. And I haven't seen anybody write in religious history an article or refer to the anti-John Robinson movement of conservative Christians. And I think even that as a starting point would open up the concept of, yes, there was a real battle going on. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Callum. Hugh, do you want to take up some of those points?
I don't think I'll add anything. I'll perhaps mention to Callum, I have written about John Robinson, and of course I've mentioned people who hated him, other Christians, but I suppose my interest was more on why a lot of people supported him. So I perhaps didn't emphasize the negative comments as much as Callum might wish. But anyway, I don't think I need to add to what Callum and Sean have already said.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know there's a monograph on Muggeridge and letters to Muggeridge coming too, which will speak into this space a little bit. So it is, we're at a point where the field is developing and changing. So if we're moving sort of beyond the parochial in view of thinking about the North American influence in the historiography and actually thinking outside of the metropolis, I wonder whether, and maybe this is probably final line of questioning across us before we take questions from those that are here, if we actually have to move beyond thinking and an obsession with the 60s too. I mean, to what extent is this book a provocation and a rallying call to reconsider the 50s and indeed start to look at the 70s, and the 60s is there as catalyst, but actually to what extent should we be refocusing our attention sort of beyond the swinging 60s or the swinging 60s and start to actually look at those reperiodizations, and how would our different sub-disciplines and historiographies look if we moved beyond permissiveness and started to look at beginnings and playings out? I don't know who wants to, so someone wants to come in first.
Okay, I'll add something since I didn't say much about the last one. I mean, I certainly think that we do need to spread out. I mean, I would say the 60s are very important as a hinge decade, which has aspects of the 50s and aspects of the 70s, and it provides a bridge, if you like, between the two. And I think the 60s certainly set in motion a lot of changes that only came into full effect in the 70s or even the 80s or even the 90s. I mean, this is just slightly sort of reinforcing what I said earlier about the changes sometimes happening step by step rather than all in some huge jump in the 60s. I think probably the steps in the 60s were bigger than in most other decades, and they often had decisive long-term implications, but it happened much more gradually. Indeed, one of the things I would, I mean, you mentioned, I'm trying to look at religion and sport, and I'm trying to relate developments in sport to developments in religion. And one of the things that interests me in the later 20th century is the development of new kinds of conservative Christianity, of strongly evangelical kind, influenced by the charismatic movement, often in independent congregations, very different in many respects from the kind of conservative Christianity of people like Mary Whitehouse and so on. And I think Callum may be overstating a bit the degree to which conservative Christianity collapsed in the 60s. I think it may have reinvented itself in new, more up-to-date forms, but I suppose that began in the late 60s. It got really going in the 70s. And we, perhaps see the continuing impact of this to some extent right up to the present day. at the other end of things, I would certainly agree that we need to look a bit more carefully at the degree to which roots of things happening in the 60s can already be identified in the 50s. And certainly nobody would question that these went very much further in the 60s, but I think there's a risk in too sort of emphatically juxtaposing the two decades. In some respects, the 60s were a reaction against the 50s, but in others, it grew out of the 50s. So I think we need to see both. And it's interesting, just as a final comment, looking at the way this conceptualization of different decades seems to differ in the religious historiography of different countries. In Germany, for instance, it now seems more or less standard to speak of the 60s and 70s as a unit. And it's also very common in many countries to see 1965 or thereabouts as a sort of turning point, so that there are two 60s, an early 60s and a late 60s, and the late 60s seen as a preparation for the 70s. So there's many different ways, I think, of looking at this.
Thanks, Hugh.
Can I come in?
Yes, please, Callum.
I absolutely agree with Hugh. I mean, Hugh's own work did much to problematize the link between the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was he who accepted, I think it was, I've forgotten his name, historian who said that the 60s really was a long 60s from roughly 1957 to
Arthur Marwick.
Yeah. Yes, I knew there was a Scottish connection. From 1957 to either some people might stop it at the oil crisis, but 74, 75, and I quite agree. And when I write about the 60s, I almost invariably am talking about the same period as Hugh. And things are complicated. One of the points I make somewhere, I think it's in this book, is the difficulty of looking at 1950s, the long 1950s, which really you could say lasted from 1945 through to 1963. And here I'm influenced by a book, again from the United States, Alan Patigny's book, which troubled the periodization of the sexual revolution in the United States. He denied that the 60s was the period of sexual revolution. He said it was the period from Pearl Harbor onwards. It was wartime that instigated sexual change. And his argument was the 1950s in the United States, with Elvis Presley, with things like Playboy and all the sex clubs and so forth. That was the decade of liberalization, not the 60s. And he also, but I mean, did make the point that if you're going to look for the 50s, in a sense, the 50s keep going into the 60s to about 1963, 64. And I think both things are true. I think the period 1957 to 1963 is a really overlap period when things are changing in many parts of the country in many ways, but not in all. And there's a real fight going on. I think that's the heart of when the battle is going on. And by the mid-60s, I think conservative Christianity lost, but it kept on losing. And there might be different dates for things. I mean, Angela Barty, who did a study of the Edinburgh Festival in terms of struggle between liberal and conservative, she argues that the struggle was really going on from 1947 until 1968. And it was in 68 that the liberals won in the Edinburgh Festival. And the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, from that point on, was the epitome of artistic liberalism for the world. So the dates can vary slightly in different places, as Sean says, but also by theme, if you like. And I think it's different for Stornoway and the Isle of Lewis. I think it was later. I mean, I make the point in the book that Stornoway and Lewis, Isle of Lewis, in fact, the Western Isles, is perhaps very distinctive in the UK in that things got more conservative in the 1970s when the Western Isles were recognized as a separate licensing authority. Until then, they were governed by Ross and Cromarty. And there were tensions between Ross and Cromarty, based in Dingwall, and the local Stornoway Town Council in Stornoway over licensing. But that was resolved from in 74, 75 with the creation of the Western Isles Council. And licensing became harder, and the police were ordered in the Western Isles were ordered to shut down all the illegal dry, the shebeens, the buchans, which littered the northern part of Lewis. So that was a very distinctive chronology, and I think you could probably extend that elsewhere. At the same time, as I make the point, there's plenty of evidence that Blackpool had a very liberal attitude towards sexual culture from as early as the 1930s, and other people have written on that extensively. So yes, locality I think is quite important. Local culture, local battles, and the idea that everything was taking its cue from Soho, I think is just not true.
Fabulous. Well, I think, Sean, if you've got something sort of burning to say, but otherwise, very shortly, I think we should break and take some questions too. So, final point.
I was going to make a point about the 1967 Sexual Offences Act that has been recently, in the 2 years ago, kind of marked and celebrated as 50 years of queer legal freedom, and male freedom in Britain, and it tends to get lumped in along with the Abortion Act as evidence of the permissive 1960s, and I think strongly that Callum's challenge to periodization in this book is extremely welcome, particularly problematizing this idea, this general idea among scholars of the ubiquity of gender conservatism in the 1950s is correct, and he does it with great empirical nuance, I think, because the conservatism, the Christian conservatism, and the secular conservatism is analysed. Yeah, the tensions between that and liberal Christianity are analysed. It's it's a melting pot. It's quite a uses violent terms like battles, and it has the flavour of a civil war, for example, an internecine civil war, and I think that demonstrates the fizz of ideas, how creative the 1950s were, particularly in terms of the individual. So really in terms of sexuality, sexual identities, women's rights, women's reproductive rights, we get to 1971, 72, 73 before there's organised demonstration of those views, and certainly among the likes of Mary Whitehouse and others, an idea that this new liberal thought is becoming dominant and very public. People are becoming much more assertive. As I say, he resonates really with scholars who looked at the queer 1950s that complicate this picture. I mean, I did criticise some of the scholars in the collection queer 1950s that a lot have been considered in this respect, except questions of religion. But other than that, this is commensurate with challenging periodization, and that was a great promise of history of gender anyway. It was that it would do so.
Thanks very much, Sean. I've not been a very good chair to the extent that we're running sort of over time, but I don't think that matters. The debate is so rich already. What I propose we do is to, take sort of 10 minutes, and if people would like to pose some questions in the chat function, we'll attempt to gather those together and gather those up and select a few on people's behalf to actually sort of pose to the panel, with the promise of kind of a freer form open debate at 7 o'clock too for those that can stay on. So if we take till 1840, it's at 6:40, and if people start to put some burning questions, ideas, or perspectives in the chat, we'll put those to our panel. Thanks very much, everyone, and see you again soon. Well, we've got, looking at the chat function, we've actually got about 5 substantive crunchy questions, and what I had been going to do is actually sort of gather in some strands and formulate those, but given that we're here and there's only sort of a smallish number that are coming through, I wondered whether we might just call upon those that have written in the chat box if they'd like to actually pose their questions. So I actually, Samuel's just actually put one in as well, and it'd be great to sort of put that in as well on lesbian motherhood. I wonder, just taking them in order really, if Grace, if you're there and you'd like to sort of pose your question about moral rearmament, turn the camera on and unmute if you'd like to, otherwise I'm happy to sort of paraphrase that.
Hi, yeah, I can you all hear me? I think I've unmuted now. Thanks for a great seminar so far, and I just wanted to say to Callum, I really enjoyed the book that we're discussing. It was a brilliant read, and I was especially excited to see a reference to moral rearmament, having spent 2 years now researching them. I definitely agree that they're very important. They were worth millions and millions and worked on an international scale, and I think there needs to be some serious study done on them. I just wanted to know if you had any plans to study in moral rearmament now that more of their materials have become available, or if that was a plan for you in the future.
Grace, I saw your chat post there, and I'd written down a note here. Grace F, please get in touch. It's long overdue, some serious study of MRA. You're absolutely right. It's a large, mysterious, rich organization. There was a lot of history of American-based evangelical organizations humping across the Atlantic in the late 1940s and 50s. Billy Graham is the obvious candidate as well, with lots of money, well-financed, and putting up lots of billboards. There were lots of MRA billboards around London, big. And in the early 1960s, they got into huge one-page adverts in newspapers, all sorts of newspapers. So there's a lot of money there. And to what end? I mean, I'd love to hear about what exactly the strategy was of moral rearmament. The bit that I did for the book was I found all these MRA letters, particularly to Cardinal Heenan, but also some to Ramsay, trying to get them on side, trying to get them to come to their theatre and meet the MRA management in Britain, and supreme reluctance on the part of the powers that be in the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. Be interesting to know what the attitude of the free churches were. So I just, because I came across MRA incidentally while pursuing the Public Morality Council, that's how I came to make that mention. But I await your study with anticipation. I haven't got any plans to do that. I am now moving away from studying Christianity mostly. I'm devoting myself to study humanism because there's a lot to be. I mean, there's a whole movement there which has not been studied, and I'm co-writing an initial history of the movement with David Nash of Oxford Brookes. But thereafter, I'm planning to look at the way in which they turned, to answer Hugh's question, the way that they turned British moral legislation their way in the mid-1960s. With so few of them, it was remarkable. So, Grace F, I want it. Please finish your PhD fast, and can I have a copy? Thanks.
Fabulous. Next is Jessica, who I see as a King student, which is fantastic, but also an early modernist. And actually, in terms of periodizations, the early modernists and the modernists need to speak to each other and learn from each other. And Jess, I don't know whether you want to sort of say something, but as I read your question, basically you're asking about issues around modernization and whether modernity and Christian modernities is something one could talk about. Do I paraphrase you all right?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jessica. Yeah, you absolutely paraphrased it perfectly. Yeah, not being an expert in this area, basically, that was the huge comparison I drew from listening to this discussion. So yeah, you hit the nail on the head, pretty much, absolutely.
And does anyone want to pick up the ball on that?
Okay, I'll say something. I have to admit, I'm always a bit uneasy about the term modernization. I believe in modernizations, but the idea that there is a that they take any general form. And of course, modernizations are usually prompted by a particular political, religious, or other agenda. So modernization in one context can be quite different from another. So I'd be cautious about the use of it. The only other thing I'd say is that big changes in the 50s and 60s may have longer roots. That certainly some of the campaigns which Callum's been particularly highlighting went back to the 1930s or even beyond. So if you like, the different eras of different kinds of modernization, rather than any kind of, if you like, single coherent process.
Can I just butt in and say, I absolutely agree with you there. After many years of focusing almost entirely on the 60s, I have been reinvigorated to see the 1930s as an interesting decade, largely because I've been trailing MI5's interest in progressives, and their files expose aspects of what was going on in terms of people rethinking the utopia, H.G. Wells's vision and the formation of the Progressive League. I think that was a very important turning point. So I'm getting into the 30s as interesting. Obviously, it's crossed over with issues about which we kind of duck in religious history, issues of the influence of Marxism, of many of those who were progressives being very sympathetic towards the USSR and the Soviet system, including those who subsequently drew back from it. But in the early 1930s, there were a lot of interesting people making the journey to USSR and doing the official tour, and thus being surveyed, unknown, by Special Branch and MI5. And every move they made, every letter they wrote and received is now copied in the MI5 files. So you can see their correspondence, you can see their ideas taking shape out with publications. And I'm getting into that because MI5 has done us a service. You can see what the intellectuals are thinking before they published.
I think,
Go on, no, Sean, I was just saying, I actually think the 30s is a really important seedbed for so much of what we encounter, and we take the Sycamore War as this period, this bookend, and we need to jump over it. But you're probably, Sean, over to you.
It was just to welcome as well Jessica's question on periodization and the question of modernization. I agree with it. We need to problematize assumptions, particularly in this area where there's not that much research. My colleagues in religious history are quoting other works and other books, but it still doesn't amount to a voluminous corpus of scholarship in the area, as far as I'm concerned. And historians should, particularly in British historiography, challenge ideas of progress and not fall into the trap of some kind of, Whiggish history as applied to either left ideas or the dominance of liberal secularity. I mean, certainly within these islands and in the United Kingdom, if we look at Northern Ireland, I see someone's got a question about religious groups in South London as well, that among fundamentalist Christian churches and groupings, younger people today are more scripturally literate and socially conservative than their grandparents were, belonging to the same fundamentalist, same religious grouping. So things don't necessarily go in a direction of acceptable liberal progress. We also have an historical and contemporaneous problem in this country with the idea of secularity. Callum's focus on the British humanists is extremely welcome. There's again, I mean, there's one or two things, but there really isn't that much work in this area. But also, I'd like to leave people with the thought that whether we think that Britain is secular or not, or whatever the periodization and trajectory of secularity versus Christian religiosity, that unlike Spain, France, and Germany, there are no strong intellectual traditions of secularity in this country. Secularity tends to be quite individual, or it is not achieved generally through educational experience. Its organizational underpinning in this country has been weak. Yeah. And also there's practically no, we talk about the early modern to the modern, there is, and contemporary, there is practically no culture of anti-clericalism either in Britain or Ireland, yeah, which makes the analysis of secularity very, very fascinating, but very, very slippery indeed.
Thanks, Sean. And I think you've probably picked up some of Mary Claire's question too about this definition of the secular and the contemporary British. I wondered whether, for the purposes of bundling some of the historical, the history of religion questions together, taking Hannah's question on the 20th century historiography, Mary Claire's question about sort of secularization, and John's question about conservative religiosity and charismatic religion and its reinvigoration and reconfiguration and renewal maybe in the 70s. Hugh and Callum, how would you speak to some of those questions in the chat function? And for those that pose them, if you want to turn your camera on and add a tiny bit, please do. It seemed to me there's a clustering of questions there.
But I say I didn't have time to read all, I was taking a break and I didn't have time to read all the questions. I don't know if you could give a very brief summary. I think I got John's question, but I think I missed the others.
Well, I wonder whether, Hannah, you also sort of were in the chat function as another seminar convener. Do you want to basically sort of sum some things up for us?
Yes, sure. And thank you so much for all of the reflections. Sorry, it's gotten very dark in my house now. Yeah, and I hope this isn't too niche of a question. I know we're coming from lots of different historiographical perspectives to this meeting today, but I just wanted to know, Callum, just if you could unpack a little bit more about your thoughts about the need for more scholarship on the relationship between liberal Christianity and conservative Christianity, and your suggestion that there was a gaping hole there. I think there has been quite a lot done in recent years, whether that's framed through the language of battle, perhaps there's differences there. It would also be really interesting to follow up on Mary Claire's point, to hear your thoughts about secularity, but also about the place of migration and race in these stories, because I think what Mary Claire is pointing to is that there is a lot of religion in Britain, and particularly as Britain has changed its composition, as more people from different parts of the world practicing different religions have moved to Britain. And so it'd be really interesting to hear your reflections on that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions and for your summary of the issues. Just picking up your own point, I wasn't saying that there was a gaping hole. I called it actually a sinkhole in relation to the study of liberal Christians and social reform. Very far from it. In fact, this morning I was drawing up a new bibliography of all the works that have been going on really since Graham Willett and Matthew Grimley and Hugh himself and Sam Brewitt-Taylor and Laura Ramsey. I was just drawing up a new list. I'm perfectly aware of all that. What is missing, the gaping hole, is about conservative Christians. The reaction to that, there's very little. I mean, Hugh says I'm somewhat missing this, but I mean, for instance, Hugh's own book on wonderful book on the religious crisis of the 1960s. There's really no reference of any substance. Even his reference to Mary Whitehouse is very, very brief in that book. It's briefer than my reference is. So we can go count each other's words and see who wins in that one. I do think there is still a gaping hole in the treatment of conservative Christianity in the whatever forms you want to. There may be varieties of conservative Christianities, and there needs to be religious historians studying that, church historians studying that, because that's not my field, not my forte. I don't do theology, so I'm not in a position to be able to judge. But I know I've got nothing to read. I'm essentially got nothing to read on As I said, nothing to read on MRA. That's coming. Great. So I would put it down to a challenge to religious historians. Get cracking on conservative Christianities, plural. Tell us what was going on. So Mary Claire's point, yes, I recall meeting with her previously about that. Yeah, I mean, religions are renewing themselves, and religion is not dead. I've never said it was. My book on Death of Christian Britain was about the death of a dominant Christian culture, not about Christianity. So yeah, sure, but the facts remain. Britain is continuing to secularize rapidly. The proportion of people without religion is now past, by some measures, the halfway point. The great example I use is Scotland, which has secularized with extraordinary speed since my childhood, and now has got more humanist weddings than all Christian weddings put together. Can you imagine that? That's the Catholic Church, Church of Scotland, the Episcopal Church, all the other Christian churches are outnumbered by the number of couples getting humanist weddings. And as soon as the London government grants legal status to humanist weddings in England and Wales, your world will change in relation. There's a huge pent-up demand in England for non-religious weddings. And pursuing that has also been the collapse of the christening of children. Baptism per child has declined sharply in England and Wales, and is continuing to do so. I just go with the statistics. Clive Field and others have been collecting these. They're on the Bryn site. There's no gainsaying the data.
Could I come in, Alana, or
yes.
Do you want?
Well, I was actually, what I'd like to do, if it's possible, is maybe actually then continue some of that conversation into the pub if people can stay on. But I wanted to take almost the last question that was posed, coming from a history of sexuality perspective, and thinking about almost medico-moral dimensions. What happens if we actually sort of inflect then the history of medicine into some of these debates, which again, oftentimes is left out of the equation. And I don't know, sort of Samuel, if you're still here, do you want to sort of just talk very quickly about your question about in vitro fertilization and lesbian motherhood?
Yeah, hi. I don't know if you can see me, actually. I had to unplug my earbuds. Perfect. So it's a bit of a selfish question in the sense that I'm not too familiar with the history of religion at all, and that's precisely why I wanted to attend the seminar. I've noticed that in some of the medical texts I've read, they speak about, almost begrudgingly, about the Archbishop's opinion about artificial insemination. I don't really know how to place it in my research. I was wondering if you had any experience or have found any mentions of artificial insemination during the 70s and 80s especially, and how you would advise me, I guess, to incorporate religion into this history, because I do think it's an important part of it, as the seminar has shown, to not ignore that aspect of history.
Thank you
Could I do
much.
a quick response, Alana, on that
Yes,
one?
please, Callum.
Thanks for that question, Samuel. I do talk about artificial insemination. I'm interested in the struggles for it. The Public Morality Council, which I spend a great deal of time studying, was utterly opposed to it in the late 1940s and convened a conference of British theologians, at which every single theologian, bar one, I'll come to in a moment, bar one, absolutely opposed artificial insemination because it was a sin. Two sins to choose from. It was either a sin because a man will have spilled his seed upon the ground or into a test tube in this case, and therefore that was a sin of masturbation, or if it was a person, a man donating, a third party man donating semen for artificial insemination, the woman who was receiving it was de facto adultery. I also point to the remarkable events when the first test tube baby was born, 1977, Louise Brown, no relation. The Catholic radio presenter, Libby, I've forgotten her set name. Alana, can you help me?
Nervous.
Purvis interviewed Cardinal John Gray of the Scottish Catholic Church, in which he lambasted the birth and said it was viewed by God as a sin. And she recalls in her autobiography that she buried the interview because it would be an embarrassment to all and sundry in the Catholic Church. So conservative Christians of various hues were against it. The one theologian who in 1947 was willing to accept it was a representative of the Society of Friends.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we might bring formal proceedings to a close on that issue of our fusing of different historiographies. Thank you very much for the questions that have been posed, and an invitation now. We'll stop recording the session so that we can